Hello and welcome to our second lecture on labor market equilibrium. Let's look at our overview again. Today we're going to be talking about a monopsony. We're going to be talking about when the firm is the sole hirer of labor in the labor market. And so they're going to face an upward sloping supply curve. And we're going to go back to assuming that the product market is competitive. So what's a monopsony? In the product market, we have a monopoly, and a monopolist is the sole firm in the product market. A monopsony is the sole firm that's doing the hiring in a particular labor market. So it's when there's one firm and it's the only buyer of a particular type of labor. And so the firm can influence the wage rate. It's not going to be a wage taker like in the competitive market. And so that means it faces an upward sloping supply curve. If the firm needs to hire more workers, it needs to increase its wage if the labor supply curve is upward sloping. Okay, it's not like in the competitive labor market case where they faced a perfectly elastic labor supply curve and they could hire all they wanted at the prevailing wage. In the case of a monopsonist, to expand its workforce, it must increase the wage to attract workers from other sectors. However, if it decreases its wage, it doesn't lose all of its workforce, as would be the case in a perfectly competitive labor market. So the average cost of a monopsonist is the average cost to the firm. It's going to simply be the wage. Okay, for example, if the wage is $20, suppose the wage would have to be $20.50 to get two workers, to attract two workers. Then the average wage is obviously 41 divided by 2 is 20.5. And so the average cost to the firm is going to be equal to the wage. And everyone gets paid the same wage in the market. And so the average cost curve is actually the same thing as the supply curve of labor. Okay? We'll keep that in mind and we'll see that in a diagram shortly. Now, marginal cost. So this is an important difference here compared to what we've looked at before. In a competitive labor market, the firm takes the wage as given, and so its marginal cost is equal to the wage. That's not going to be true anymore because there's going to be an additional cost when you hire an additional worker, and that's because you have to increase the wage. Okay, the marginal cost is the new wage plus the cost of paying the higher wage to existing workers. Okay, there can only be one wage, so if you want to hire more workers and you need to increase the wage, the cost to the firm is not only the cost of paying that additional worker, but they have to pay all of the workers they've hired up to that point, or existing workers, the difference in the wage and how much it had to increase. So in that case, the marginal cost is always going to be higher than the average cost, or it's going to go above the supply curve. Profit maximization is going to occur when, and in general, it's always when the marginal benefit, equals the marginal cost. You're going to hire workers until the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. Here, you're going to hire workers as long as the value of the marginal product of labor is greater than the marginal cost. So instead of W, we have marginal cost. Okay, so we have a diagram here. We're looking at the wage and labor space. We have our supply curve, and as we said, the supply curve is the average cost curve. So for example, if we want to hire this amount of labor, we need to pay a wage of this amount. And whatever that wage is, that's going to be the average cost per worker. Okay, for a competitive labor market, the profit maximizing condition would be that the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the wage. But now the wage is, we don't assume a constant wage. The monopsonist isn't a wage taker. suppose that at a wage of $7, the firm could hire 9 workers. Okay, so that information is clearly what the supply curve tells us. So in this case, their average cost would be $7. Now, if this firm wanted to hire an additional worker, say 10 workers instead of 9, the supply curve would tell us that the wage would have to be increased to $7.50. So they need to increase it 50 cents to attract that last unit of labor, but they got to pay everyone $7.50. So what's then the marginal cost of hiring this additional unit of labor? Well, it's what you pay the new worker, $7.50, plus the difference between $7.50 and $7 to all of the additional workers. Okay, so the 10th worker is going to cost $7.50, but you have to pay the other 9 workers 50 cents more. Okay, and so that's $4.50. So the marginal cost is $12. Okay, and so that's above the wage. And so the marginal cost will always be above the average cost or the supply curve, right? Because you have to pay the existing workers the difference. So in terms of the profit maximizing condition, we would set this marginal cost curve equal to the marginal revenue product or value marginal product curve. Okay, so let's look at in more detail the profit maximizing condition for a monopsony. Okay, so we have our value of marginal product. Okay, so this is the marginal product of labor times the price. We have our supply curve. So our competitive equilibrium wage would be here. Okay, but we're not in a competitive labor market. The monopsonist would want to hire labor while the marginal benefit of doing so is greater than the marginal cost. The marginal benefit is just the value of the marginal product of labor, okay, and the marginal cost is here. So the firm would want to hire as long as this is above this. And so the optimum point would be right here, where the marginal cost is equal to the value of marginal product. Okay, and now the wage that they would have to pay is obtained by going down to the supply curve, which tells us labor supply given different wages, what we need. So the monopsonist would have to pay WM, and it would want to hire MN workers. So that would be the profit maximizing condition for a monopsony. Now, if you compare this to the competitive equilibrium, which would be here, so in a competitive environment, in the market, this would be the overall supply curve, this would be the overall demand curve for labor, and it would be here, would be the optimum. So clearly we see that if everything else constant, but the firm is a monopsonist, we would expect it to hire less labor and pay a lower wage than the competitive equilibrium. And then we would also end up with unemployment. Okay? The seller's surplus would be here. So this is for the worker surplus. Whereas before it would have been this entire triangle here. Okay, so the seller's surplus has decreased. This diagram here shows more explicitly the difference between a monopsonist and a competitive firm. Okay, the profit maximizing point is where? I'll give you a second to think about it. Where's the profit maximizing point for the monopsonist? Oh, sorry. What is the profit maximizing employment for a competitive firm? Okay, so I'll give you a second to find that. Where would that be? Okay, it would be at point Z. the wage would be WC, the number of workers hired would be NC. Now what about for the monopsonist? What point would the monopsonist choose? How much labor would they choose to maximize profit? Point X. Okay, because that's where their marginal benefit equals their marginal cost. In other words, their value of marginal product of labor is equal to the marginal cost. If they hire any more, they would be losing money. And so their employment is going to be lower, and the wage they're going to pay is going to be lower as well. Remember, they have market power. So wages and employment will be below competitive levels in the case of a monopsonist. So what's the labor demand curve for a monopsonist? So remember before, in a competitive market, we derived a labor demand curve by tracing out profit maximizing levels and the associated wages. So we had different wages that could occur in the market, and we set them equal to the value of marginal product to get the profit maximizing amount of labor. But so here we have the labor demand curve, but a monopsonist isn't a wage taker. So only in a competitive market can we think of this value of the marginal product of labor as a demand curve, because in a competitive market we have different wages that could happen in the market. So there's variation in the wage that could happen in the market, and the firm just takes that as given and has no choice. They take it as given and they set it equal to their value of marginal product, and then you get a certain employment level. But a monopsonist isn't a wage taker. Okay, they're going to optimize based on their marginal cost and the value of marginal product, and that's going to determine the amount of employment and the wage that they need to pay. So they're a wage maker, you could say, instead of a wage taker. So there's only one point here that maximizes profit. We can't vary the wage here and find different levels of employment. So it doesn't make sense in the context of them having a supply curve. Basically, there's only one point, WM and EM. We can't vary the wage and get different employment levels for the monopsonist. So the monopsonist does not have a labor demand curve, and it's analogous to why a monopolist has no supply curve, if you remember from your microeconomics course. So monopsonist markets have some degree of inelasticity in terms of the supply of labor, and that implies they have some monopsony power. Now the reason for that is, we're saying they have market power in the sense that they can lower the wage and not lose all of their workforce. Remember, in a competitive firm, if they lower the wage, they will lose all their workers. But that's not the case for a monopsonist. They don't face a perfectly elastic supply curve. And it's true that many firms would have some element of monopsony power in the short run, meaning they could lower the wage, but they typically wouldn't exercise this power in the long run, as it would lead to problems of recruitment, turnover, and morale. There are some examples of monopsony in the long run that are popular, such as an industry town in an isolated region. So for example, there's maybe a very large nickel mine in a small community, and in that case that firm would be considered a monopsonist. It's not competing with anyone else for labor in that area. You could also think of a labor market where workers have specialized skills, very specialized, that are only useful at a specific firm. And in that case, they would face an upward sloping labor supply curve based on workers with those specified skills. So perfect monopolistic wage differentiation. So existing workers receive higher wages when a monopsony raises the wage rate. They end up getting a surplus. The monopsonist could try to appropriate or capture this seller's surplus by differentiating its otherwise homogeneous workforce so as to pay each worker only their reservation wage. So what we're saying here is basically this is analogous to price discrimination for a monopolist, but in this case the firm is hiring labor and they are a monopoly and a monopsonist because they're the only hirer of labor in that market. And so if they were able to determine the reservation wage of each worker and just pay them that, they would be able to extract all of the worker surplus. Okay, so if that's the case, then the supply schedule will be equal to not only the average cost but also the marginal cost, because they would just, if they want an extra worker, that extra worker, they would just have to pay them that higher wage to entice them to work. In our previous example, that would be the $7.50. So they would just have to pay the $7.50. They wouldn't have to increase the wage for all of the other workers. That's only if they were able to determine what each person's reservation wage was and be able to maybe give them different job titles or something to disguise that it's actually a different job and really it's the same. So there are cases where firms will try to do this. They may try to conceal higher wages or use non-wage mechanisms to attract additional labor. So there are different types of ways. So in that example with having to hire the extra person and pay a wage of $7.50, perhaps they could give that person, entice that person with maybe some extra vacation time and get them to work at the $7 an hour. So then the marginal cost to them would be not much at all. Okay, let's think about minimum wage legislation now. So in our model with our labor demand and labor supply, what happens if we impose a minimum wage that's binding? And binding means that the minimum wage would be above the free market wage or competitive wage. Well, we would expect an adverse employment effect. So let's suppose the minimum wage is imposed to be here, which is above the market. Then this minimum wage, we see that the quantity demanded of labor is going to be lower. The quantity supply is going to be higher. This higher wage is going to exceed certain people's reservation wage, and then they'll want to enter the labor force. And so what you end up with is unemployment. Now, is this going to be something that would last forever? Well, if the minimum wage is enforced, yes. So a minimum wage, given our model that we've considered so far, would predict that we would have a higher level of unemployment because we're not letting the market go to where it wants and clear. And the amount of unemployment would depend on the elasticity of the labor demand curve. So in my example here, I show a labor demand curve that's much steeper, and if the labor demand curve was this instead of this, then the number of unemployed people would only be this amount as opposed to this amount. Now, what about a monopsony and minimum wage? Okay, so let's look at our diagram here. We have our equilibrium, which would be in the competitive market. So our competitive wage would be here, where the demand for labor would be equal to the supply of labor. Now, a monopsonist would want to hire this amount of labor and pay this wage, W0. So W0 and N0 are the monopsonist profit maximizing wage and labor combinations. Now suppose a minimum wage is put just above W0 and below the competitive wage. Well, then in this region, the marginal cost now of hiring will be this line. It's not going to be this anymore. It's not going to be this. It's going to be this. So they'll have to pay more here and then they'll get less there. But you can see for them to maximize profit now, things are going to be different. So the actual marginal cost curve will be this whole thing here, this yellow line. So from here to here, I'll go back a moment. So from here to here, the firms must pay the minimum wage. Okay? That's the minimum wage. They must pay that. But if they want to hire any workers to the right of this amount, they're going to have to pay wages that are higher than W1. So they'll have to go along the supply curve. So their optimum point now would be here. And so they would want to hire N1 units of labor. So under certain circumstances, a minimum wage could increase employment, but only in a monopsony market. But the minimum wage would have to be, would have to be above what the monopsonist wants to do, above their profit maximizing wage, and below the competitive wage. So there's considerable debate about the impact of minimum wages on employment. Earlier evidence suggests a disemployment effect. Some Canadian evidence suggests that the short run effect is small, but there's in the long run there's a disemployment effect. So it might be higher in the long run. There was a very interesting paper, they're somewhat older, but they're very interesting, and they're done in the US. The one paper was done by Card and Kruger in 1994, and then a follow-up paper by Newmark and Washer. This is the abstract for the Card and Kruger paper. What happened in New Jersey in 1992 was that they increased the minimum wage from $4.25 to $5.05 per hour. And so what the authors of this study did is they surveyed 410 fast food restaurants in New Jersey and a neighboring state, Pennsylvania, before and after the rise in the minimum wage. And then they compared changes in wages, employment, and prices at stores in New Jersey relative to stores in Pennsylvania where there wasn't a minimum wage increase. And in a nutshell, the results were surprising. They found that the increase in the minimum wage led to an increase in employment, and they do some things to back that up. However, another study came out afterwards who essentially did the same thing, except they found better data. They found payroll data, which should be more reliable than the survey data that the previous authors used, and they found different results. They found that it actually reduced employment. So it's not as easy as you would think to get reliable and consistent figures on this. Okay, let's do some practice problems. Okay, suppose we have a perfectly competitive labor market. Labor demand is equal to 120 minus 2W. Labor supply is equal to 8W. So W is the wage, L is the quantity of labor. What are the equilibrium values of wage and employment? Suppose the government imposed a minimum wage of $14 per hour. Now, what are the values of the wage and employment? And then C, repeat A, but now assume that the market is a monopsony. And note that the total expenditure on labor, or W as a function of L times L, that's what the total expenditure of labor is. W, which is a function of L times L. And WL is the inverse supply of labor. And this thing is equal to L squared over 8. So this is the total expenditure on labor. Okay. So I'll give you a moment if you want to pause and solve this for yourself. I recommend doing that and then looking at the answer. So I'll just wait a second, and you might want to pause it and we'll come back. Okay, so when we set the supply and demand curves equal to each other and solve for the equilibrium, we get that the wage is $12 and the amount of labor is $96. Now, if the wage was required to be $14 an hour, we can find out easily by substituting this into the demand for labor curve that the firms would hire only 92 workers. And of course, the wage is going to be the minimum wage at 14. So clearly there was a reduction in employment. Okay, now we're asked to find out what it would be if there was a monopsony. So let's find the profit maximizing condition for the monopsony. So we know we need to set some kind of a marginal benefit equal to marginal cost. The marginal benefit is the inverse of the original labor demand. So it's going to be the value of marginal product, right? And so that's going to be the inverse of the labor demand curve, so that we have wage isolated and wage will be a function of L. Now the marginal cost is going to be, in this case, it's going to be the derivative of the total expenditures function. The total expenditures function is telling us what the total cost is of hiring workers, right? It's a function of L, so if we plug in different numbers of labor, it tells us what the total expenses are. But we want the marginal expense or marginal cost. Okay, so we take the first derivative of that, and then to solve for the equilibrium, we're going to set those two things equal to each other. We're told in the question that the total expenditures is L squared over 8. So the marginal cost is the derivative of this with respect to L, and that equals L divided by 4. This is our labor demand curve, but we want the inverse. So we're just going to solve for W. When we solve for W, we get this, and then this is our value of marginal product, and it's 60 minus L divided by 2. So we're going to set those two equal to each other and solve for L, and we get 80. Okay, so the amount of labor that the monopsonist was wanted to hire would only be 80. And that makes sense given what we were looking at before. We saw that the monopsonist would hire less labor and would actually pay a lower wage as well. The wage here would only be $10. Okay, some more questions. Which of the following statements is false? The monopsonist has no demand curve for labor. The monopsonist has market power in the labor market. The monopsonist is a profit maximizing firm. And the monopsonist is a wage taker. So I think everyone should be clear on this one. Which one is false? It is D. They're not a wage taker. Okay, next question. Which of the following statements regarding a monopsony is false? A, the equilibrium wage and the equilibrium employment levels are lower than what they would be if the labor market were perfectly competitive. B, all workers except the marginal worker are paid more than their reservation wage. And the total wage bill is lower in the case of a monopsony. And then D, none of the above statements are false. Well, A we know is true. Okay, that's what we learned in our model. We learned that the monopsony would end up, the equilibrium would end up being one in which the wage and employment levels were lower. B, we know that all the workers except the marginal worker are paid more than their reservation wage. If you remember when we looked at our numerical example, to get that 10th worker, we needed to pay that person $7.50, which is exactly what their reservation wage was. But all the existing workers had a lower reservation wage and are now going to get paid more. C, the total wage bill is lower in the case of a monopsony. Well, that's not true because we know that the marginal cost curve increases and it's above the average cost curve. So the answer here is D, none of the above statements are false. Next question. What is the primary difference between a monopsonist and a firm which operates in a perfectly competitive labor market? A, the monopsonist is likely to be more profitable. In order to recruit another worker, the monopsonist incurs a larger increase in labor costs. In order to recruit another worker, the monopsonist incurs a smaller increase in labor costs. The monopsonist hires such that the marginal physical product of labor is equal to the average labor cost, but the non-monopsonist does not. The labor supply curve is irrelevant for the monopsonist. So we know the last one's not true. We know D is not true. It's not set equal to the average cost of labor. That's the wage. C, in order to recruit another worker, the monopsonist incurs a smaller increase in labor costs. That's not true. We know that they increase for a monopsonist. So the answer here is B. And we don't know about A because it depends on the product market. A minimum wage set above the market equilibrium could lead to more workers being hired at the higher wage if the product produced is sold in a perfectly competitive market, the employer is a monopsonist, we have a backward bending labor supply curve, or the supply of labor curve is horizontal. Well, the supply of labor curve is horizontal only in perfect competition, okay, and they can hire as much as they want at the going wage, so that's not true. If the supply curve is on a, if we're considering the backward bending portion of the supply curve, higher wages means less labor, so that's not true. The answer is B, and that's the case where we showed a peculiar case where if you could have an increase in the minimum wage as long as it's in a certain range, and it would increase employment if the employer was a monopsonist. So the answer is B. Okay, when a monopsonist hires an additional worker, the wage for that worker and for all workers hired at lower wage rates must be increased. And that causes unemployment, losses for the monopsonist, profits for the monopsonist, the marginal labor cost curve to lie above the supply curve for labor, or the supply curve for labor to lie above the marginal labor cost curve. So the answer here is D. If you remember, this is the reason why the marginal cost curve increases faster than the supply. If a profit maximizing monopsony is hiring workers at a point where its marginal revenue product is less than its marginal labor cost, let's think about this. So it's at a point in terms of its hiring where the marginal revenue product, so that's the marginal benefit of hiring a worker, is less than its marginal cost. That's not good. So that must mean that the monopsonist has hired too many workers. So the answer there is A. Okay, we have a diagram here of a monopsony. We have our marginal cost, supply of labor, value of the marginal product of labor. And this is asking us, if a firm faced the market for labor as shown above, it will hire how many laborers and pay how much in terms of wages. Where's our profit maximizing point for the monopsonist? We're assuming this is a monopsonist. So we would go here at this point, where the value of marginal product of labor and the marginal cost are equal. We look down. A is the quantity of labor that would be hired. So OA is the laborers. So it's either going to be B or D. What's going to be the wage? Is the wage going to be here? No. The wage is going to be here. We need to look at the supply curve to know what the wage has to be at least to get a amount of workers. It has to at least be Z. Okay, so the answer here is B. OA and OZ. Okay, same diagram, but another question. Suppose the government wanted to impose a wage that would result in an efficient allocation of labor, similar to what a perfectly competitive labor market would yield. If that's true, it would set the wage at what, and labor would be, how much labor would be employed? Well, the government would want to set the wage at Y so that B number of labor units would be employed, because that would be the competitive equilibrium. Okay, this would be an efficient allocation. You would have the maximum surplus. Okay, so the answer would be OY, OB. Okay, well, thank you very much. This concludes our lecture on the labor market equilibrium. Our next class, we will be talking about compensating wage differentials. So we're going to be looking at reasons why workers who are otherwise homogeneous would get different wages in a competitive equilibrium. Well, thank you very much, and we will see you next time. Bye.